From Sunday 8 November to Tuesday 10 November 2015, we, Sophie, Candice and Faye, visited the city of Nuremberg in Germany. The goal of our Nuremberg trip was to make a documentary about the Nuremberg trials and the history of Nuremberg as a crucial city for the Nazi regime. This documentary will show viewers the most important sites in Nuremberg's history and interviews with different experts who told us more about the time, place and people, from The Hague to Nuremberg. The city is internationally known for the war crimes trials that took place in Nuremberg after the Second World War, from 1945 to 1949. These trials encompassed both the International Military Tribunal, which was created by the Allied forces, and the subsequent Nuremberg trials, organized by the USA authorities. The city of Nuremberg was chosen as the location for these trials because it played a crucial role in the rise of the Nazi regime. The Nazi Party selected the city to be the site of several enormous party conventions, the Nuremberg rallies. We started our visit at the Documentation Center, which commemorates the Nazi Party rallies that took place there. The Documentation Center is located at Congress Hall on the old Nazi Party rally grounds. The plan for the Nazi Party rally grounds and the buildings was designed by the Nazi architect Albert Speer in 1933. The Nazi Party rally grounds encompassed Congress Hall, the Zeppelin Field, the Leopold Arena, the stadium, the March Field and the Great Road. Congress Hall was designed to house 50,000 spectators. The Nuremberg rallies were held in 1927 and 1929 and annually between 1933 and 1939. Nazi Party rallies were mass festivals organized for the community and to honor Hitler, who was called the uncontested leader of the Nazi Party. Following Hitler's declaration in 1933, Nuremberg was officially appointed City of the Nazi Party rallies. The Nazi Party was the dominant party in Germany, and the new mayor of the city, Julius Streicher, ensured the continuation of the Nazi Party rallies on an annual basis. The Documentation Center itself opened its doors in 2001 in the former Congress Hall. The center is designed by the Austrian architect Günther Domenik, who created a modern center with a lot of light to counteract the darkness of the National Socialist regime. Here we spoke with Dr. Martina Christmeier, a scientific researcher at the Documentation Center. She told us more about the history of the party rallies.
So like in a theater, so you must use fire, flags, symbols, a golden swastika, for example. So it was like in a theater for the installation of the party of Adolf Hitler, the leader of the party, and also on the other part, one part the leader, and on the other part the people, the community, the Volksgemeinschaft. All this was very important. And well, they of course they had their speeches, but it wasn't the most important thing, because when you're in the crowd, so you hardly could understand what the speaker was telling you, because the quality of the sound wasn't that good. And it was the emotion to be part of the event, to go home and to tell all the friends, the neighbors, the family, what you saw in Nuremberg, what were your emotions. You were part of it, and so it was a great feeling, at least the first years for all the participants here. So the last years it was more difficult to gain participants, because it was also boring. So it was so, because you need to wait for hours you wait for the beginning of your event, for your parade, or you must gather on one place and wait. So for example, also for example, Hitler Youth and Reichsarbeitsdienst, SSA, so they stayed in tents, in big tents. So when it was rainy in September, could be. So it was muddy, and it was cold. it wasn't very comfortable. So that's the other side. So, but that's not the side. This side propaganda didn't say. So you must think about it also. So in the first years it was a great propaganda show, and as you also see when you see the videos with the eyewitnesses, so they say it was really a pleasure and a great honor to be here in Nuremberg. So they were the best of the Hitler Youth, of the Reichsarbeitsdienst. Yes, kind of military training, but this was for get used on spectaculars like this, also for the participants. And also they made a lot of experiences by transport, because when 1 million people came here to Nuremberg, so they mostly came by train, so there was a lot of experience by transportation. They used it in the world to transport the soldiers to the east, and also for a lot they collect a lot of experiences, for example by to prepare and to all the food for about 1 million, or let it be 500,000 participants. So everything, and they used kind of Feldküche kitchens. They used also in the war, and so they had all the experiences very useful for the war in the years afterwards.
During the Second World War, Nuremberg was an important site of military production, which included aircrafts, submarines, and tank engines. It was for this reason that the city of Nuremberg was targeted by Allied forces and severely damaged in Allied bombing from 1943 to 1945. The Nuremberg Palace of Justice remained largely undamaged and was therefore selected as the venue for the Nuremberg trials in 1945. Our next stop was the Palace of Justice and the Memoriam Nuremberg Trials, which is located in the Palace of Justice. The Memoriam opened its doors in 2010 and informs visitors about the background of the trials and their location. The decision to locate the International Military Tribunal in Courtroom 600 in Nuremberg at the largely undamaged Palace of Justice was taken during the London Conference of August 1945. The International Military Tribunal was created by the Allied forces, the United States of America, the Soviet Union, France and Great Britain, and started sessions 3 months after the Second World War ended. 22 of the most important political and military leaders of the Third Reich were brought before the tribunal. The subsequent trials took place from 1946 to 1949 and included cases against German industrialists, lawyers and doctors. For the first time in history, defendants were indicted for crimes under international law: conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The trial before the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg was conducted under the presidency of Lord Justice Geoffrey Lawrence. Robert H. Jackson, the key figure in the creation of the International Military Tribunal, was appointed as the chief prosecutor of the war criminals. Examples of significant defendants during the first trial are Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess. Wilhelm Frick was one of the noteworthy defendants during the second set of trials. At the Memoriam, we spoke to Dr. Henrike Clause, the director of the Memoriam, inside Courtroom 600. She told us about Courtroom 600 and the defendants.
When you come to the courtroom today, the first thing that you realize is that the courtroom seems to be smaller than usually people expect it to be, especially when they know photographs or historical film footage from the Nuremberg trials. And in fact, it's true, the courtroom is smaller than it used to be. The reason is that when the decision was made for Nuremberg as the location for the trial, they easily found out that this courtroom is the biggest courtroom, ever was the biggest courtroom in this whole building complex, but still not big enough for the trial and for the audience they were expecting. In this regard, especially press reporters coming to Nuremberg. So what they did, they took out the complete back wall. And then on the right-hand side there was the judges' bench. So the judges' bench was a little bit higher, so it was more or less, they were really more or less sitting in front of the windows. Well, 8 seats, 1 seat for each nation that was sending a judge to this tribunal. They had 1 seat for their judge and 1 additional seat for the deputy. So we had 4 judges here during the Nuremberg trials, but we had 8 people seated up there at the judges' bench. When the decision was made to hold the trial here in Nuremberg, of course there was also the question of who should be in the dock, who should be accused of these crimes. And in the end they were talking about 20 and 24 defendants that were planned to be they were talking about 24 defendants that were planned to be accused during the Nuremberg trial. In the end, there were 21 sitting in the dock. So the first person missing in the dock was Robert Lai, who committed suicide the day after he had received the indictment. So he committed suicide in the Nuremberg prison. So that was the first one missing. The second person missing in the dock was Gustav Krupp, who was released for health reasons. So he was not able to attend the trial, and he never appeared before the tribunal. And the third person, who was not here in Nuremberg, never came to this courtroom, is Martin Bormann, who was tried in absentia. So that's the reason why we have this confusing situation at first sight, that we have 21 people in the courtroom, but we have 22 judgments, because Martin Bormann was tried until the very end in absentia. So in the end he was sentenced to death by hanging. And that's the other reason why we have 10 of the defendants that were that were executed out of originally 12 persons who had been sentenced to death. So of these originally 12 sentences to death, Hermann Göring committed suicide before his planned execution, and Martin Bormann was not here, so he couldn't be executed. Since the early 1970s, we know that Martin Bormann had already been dead at that time, because he died during his attempt of escaping from Berlin in 1945. So these 21 people who were here in the dock were the highest ranking representatives of the Nazi regime. So that were those ones, at least the allies were able to put on trial, because of course they had been looking for other people as well, but were not able to capture them. So, and the most important persons you would expect to have in such a trial are of course Hitler, Himmler and Goebbels. All of them committed suicide during the end of the Second World War, so they were not available for such a trial. And that made Göring to become the most prominent, I would say the most prominent of all of the defendants. That's, by the way, also the reason why he was seated in the left front corner of the dock, because during all the Nuremberg trials, always the seat in the first row on the left-hand side, so at the corner of the dock, was the seat for the most important, or at least the defendant, the allies or the prosecutors considered to be the most important defendant of all.
Hermann Wilhelm Göring. Die Anklagebehörde hat in ihren Schlussplädoyers die Verteidigung und ihre Beweisführung als völlig wertlos behandelt. Die unter Eid gemachten Ausführungen der Angeklagten wurden von ihr dort als absolut wahr angenommen, wo diese zur Stützung der Anklage dienen konnten. Aber im gleichen Augenblick als Meineid bezeichnet, wo diese Aussagen die Anklage widerlegten.
After our visit to the Palace of Justice, we visited the International Nuremberg Principles Academy. The Academy educates in international criminal law and its challenges and provides special human rights training. The Academy is named after the Nuremberg Principles of 1950, which were adopted after the trial and can be seen as the basis for modern international criminal law. In 1947, 1 year after the end of the first Nuremberg trial, the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 177 in order to codify the Nuremberg Principles. The International Law Commission subsequently codified the 7 principles in 1950. At the Academy we spoke to Bernd Borchardt, the founding director of the Academy, and Dr. Sigal Horowitz, who works for the Educational Department of the Academy and who is a specialist in international criminal law and transitional justice. We spoke with them about the German perception of the trial, how the public initially supported the International Military Tribunal, but rallied against the subsequent trials held by the USA. Additionally, they spoke about the importance of the rule of law on both the national and global level, and how the political, military and economic leaders of Germany were to be tried in Nuremberg according to the rule of law.
What's the idea of transitional justice, part of the negotiations on the tribunal?
Well, the conceptual idea of transitional justice was only developed much later. So you couldn't say that this was part of the negotiations. But the Allies had concepts of re-educating the Germans. Even the word was used in that sense. So many elements which we consider today as part of transitional justice were part of this of the concept of changing Germany that encompassed the legal, the criminal law side, of course, with the Nuremberg trials, the subsequent trials, the trials of the other allies, the trials of the German judiciary. And then later on of the German state. Then it encompassed dealing with elite change, which was undertaken. Many people were in internment camps and so on. Then it dealt with compensation. I mean, paying compensation, something that went on until, which is still ongoing today. For forced labor, for instance, and it encompasses, of course, a wide political complex and the wide political questions of avoiding reoccurrence. I mean, the way Germany was bound into the Western system, and later also the reunified Germany was integrated into the Western system.
I just add that the trial itself, if you look at the motivations and the negotiations to set up the tribunal, the rule of law was the fundamental principle that the Allied forces tried to promote globally. So this is a change from a power politics to a rule of law-based politics, and I think on a global scale, this introduces a different rules of the game, and this connects to ideas of transitional justice, of turning from sort of a dictatorship, man-based power structures into more peaceful and rule-based regimes throughout. And so if you look at the international focus, and this is one of the arguments of the US, trying to persuade the other Allied forces to go in the way of trials as opposed to a political solution, for example, executions of the Axis powers. So I think that the whole notion of rule of law and installing that not only in Germany but also in international politics globally can link the International Military Tribunal to transitional justice on a more global level. We do still speak of rule of law as one of the fundamental goals of transitional justice. So this is not just on the internal level, but also more internationally. And I think that's also very important to remember about the trial.
After the trial, was there a general feeling that justice had been done on both sides?
Well, this is one of the issues which is fairly under-researched in Germany and worldwide. The effect of the trial on and how it was perceived in Germany and why it was perceived in that way. There has been some polling has been done by the Americans in the context of the trials, and the reaction of the population was, with a vast majority, was positive in 45-46. This changed with the start of the 50s, late 40s and 50s. How this change came about in public opinion, to put it into a nutshell, in 46, citizens of Nuremberg protested in front of the courthouse when three of these guys were acquitted. And in 49, there was a demonstration in Landsberg. This is a big prison where they were in, and where people were asking for amnesty. And this was a big demonstration as well. And how that came about, there are theories. Few authors have been writing about it, but this is fairly under-researched. The main arguments which are mentioned in literature is, first of all, the subsequent trials went deeper into the society. The population couldn't say anymore, or the upper bourgeoisie couldn't say anymore, it was them, the Nazis, and not us, because we're going against diplomats, against doctors, against army generals, etc., etc., and not only against the elite of the NS system. The second argument was that it had to do also with the reintegration of the part of the Protestant church in Germany which was closer to the regime, so that the Protestant church was on a more nationalistic level. And the third aspect was which is mentioned, is that people in Germany got more aware and became more part of their perceptions, the suffering of Germans, in particular after the war, all 16 million refugees, 16 million refugees, 1 to 2 million dying. And that this contributed to the shift of perception as well. But this is, as I said, fairly under-researched.
The legal debates at the time show that the German lawyers were, obviously, they were criticizing the Nuremberg trial, the International Military Tribunal's proceedings, for targeting, of course, only the one side, and they called it victor's justice. So there was a whole idea that they were one-sided, that the Allied forces had committed crimes as well, and they were not standing trial for it. And there was this idea that German victims were not accounted for in the context of the trial. So these were sort of the legal arguments challenging or criticizing the trial by German legal scholars throughout the 50s, 60s, and this also changes later. There were other challenges, obviously, from a legal perspective, but in relation to your question of whether justice was done to both sides, those were the main arguments. I think that also changed over time, and with the Germans increasing inclination to deal with the past on many levels, as we heard before, there was also more of acceptance of the trial and of its results and procedures.
And this was a very long drawn process. One may say that it started with the Auschwitz trial in 63, 64. The students' revolt, which in the US was much more about the Vietnam War, was in Germany also about the question to the parent generation, what have you done? And other then came more trials, Majdanek, Sobibor, etc., and all that with a lot of high visibility in the media. So people started to have a TV set at home and saw all the pictures. So this slowly contributed to the shift. The American serial Holocaust in the late 70s had a tremendous impact. So this was a gradual shift, which then led to another paradigm shift or paradigm change in the public perception in Germany.
The tribunal was the first international criminal tribunal with a thoroughly negotiated charter and detailed definitions of 3 international crimes that could hold individuals responsible under international law. Why did the parties involved decide to create such a tribunal at this moment in history?
You want to start?
Sure. So again, as I said, there was a sort of a willingness to shift from power politics to rule-based politics, and I think it was part of the lessons learned also from the First World War, where the Versailles Treaty, there was an attempt there to establish a tribunal beforehand, which then resulted in, the decision to let Germany, in this case Turkey and Germany, deal with the perpetrators in their national systems. And we know in Germany you had the Leipzig trials as a result, which were more or less a farce. And so looking back, they said, well, we're not going to trust the Germans to try their own perpetrators. And we do want to move towards this rule of law-based politics, international politics. And so I think the Allied forces felt strongly, and particularly the Americans, who kind of had this tone more forcefully than the other forces. I think they had really thought that the only solution would be an international tribunal at this case. And also there was a statement that international law prohibits certain acts, even if they're legal internally. And so, what one nation may not view as illegal and therefore may not prosecute, should be prosecuted under international law.
The American judge of the tribunal proposed the drafting of a code of international criminal law in 1946. Why did it take 43 years before negotiations started in 1989 on a permanent international criminal court?
Well, the short answer is the Cold War. And the impossibility of collaboration between the powers of the world on anything, basically. And so this polarized world prevented cooperation. There was work on the draft done since very early. So already in the early 50s, you have a draft statute of crimes against mankind that the International Law Commission in the UN had already presented. It's just that when it comes to decision making on the international level, it was a bit hampered by the power politics of the time, the Cold War. And so but there were behind the scenes, drafts being prepared and work being done, and so there was a process that was ongoing that could only materialize after the end of the Cold War.
How can you justify that the tribunal's charter, the case law of the tribunal, and the Nuremberg principles in general are the basis for modern international criminal law, if only a few countries were involved in its creation? Can one say that the basis for modern international law lies in the negotiations, agreements, and judgments of the war's victors?
Well, again, as I said, the idea of introducing the rule of law as a basis for international relations was revolutionary at the time, and it was endorsed by the larger international community. So while a few states at the time proposed these ideas, they became very quickly endorsed in the Nuremberg principles and in the Genocide Convention 48 and in all the human rights conventions, and then later in the international tribunals of today by the entire international community. So yes, it was the origin, which was proposed by a few, but then quite quickly endorsed by many nations, and therefore can be a legitimate basis for modern international criminal law.
In 1945, lawyers, legal scholars, and representatives from this small group of states flocked to the city of Nuremberg to participate in the trial before the International Military Tribunal as judges, prosecutors, and legal officers. These representatives of the international community stayed in what was then called the Grand Hotel of Nuremberg while proceedings were ongoing. The International Military Tribunal also attracted the international media, who came to Nuremberg to report on the trial. Journalists, as well as renowned writers such as Hemingway and Steinbeck, from all over the world came to the city for this newsworthy event, and during their visit they stayed at the Faber-Castell Castle. During this period, the castle was a global village in itself. Journalists from all corners of the world slept in the same chambers, played the same games, and drank together in a small bar of the castle. Here, in this small room, journalists exchanged gossips and news and discussed the trial as it unfolded. Since September of this year, the castle holds an exhibition about the press camp and the rooms used by the reporters. The International Military Tribunal brought the international community to Nuremberg, and for a short period of time, Nuremberg was the center of the world. The city will always be remembered for the trials that took place there and the principles which were developed during that time, and which still form the basis of modern international criminal law.
Privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. This tribunal, while it is novel and experimental, is not the product of abstract speculation, nor is it created to vindicate legalistic theories. This inquest represents the practical effort of four of the most mighty of nations, with the support of 15 more, to utilize international law